1981 Barents Sea. A Delta III-class Soviet ballistic missile submarine cut silently through the inky depths 200 nautical miles north of Murmansk. The crew is tense. Beneath them lies NATO-patrolled water. The sonar officer leans forward, headphones pressed tight, eyes locked on the readout. He hears nothing but ambient drift, the distant rumble of thermal layers, the occasional ping from a Soviet escort destroyer nearby. All is quiet. Too quiet. Then, just for a moment, something shifts, a faint fluctuation in the low-frequency band. Not a wail, not a seismic shift. Something regular, mechanical. But before a triangulation ping can be sent, it's gone. Vanished. As if it had never been there. 3 days later, back in Severomorsk, Soviet Naval Command receives a signal they were never meant to hear. Intercepted acoustic data. Exact coordinates. Bearing. Speed. Draft depth. Engine modulation. All of it captured by the Americans. An undetected U.S. submarine, most likely a Los Angeles-class fast attack boat, had trailed their prized ballistic missile submarine for over 36 hours, recording everything, remaining entirely invisible. Not a single Soviet sonar ping had touched it. Not one anti-submarine sweep had caught a trace. It hadn't evaded them. It had simply never been seen. Admiral Gorshkov himself was reportedly furious. Not just because of the incursion, but because the incursion proved something far worse. The Americans had built a submarine so quiet, so ghost-like, it could swim through the most fortified Soviet waters completely undetected. It invalidated the Soviet perimeter strategy. It shattered confidence in sonar nets. It exposed the very foundation of their naval doctrine. That mass, sensors, and saturation would always triumph over stealth. But now, silence had won. And somewhere beneath the polar ice, an American boat was already on another patrol. No radar, no comms, no splash, only darkness, and the sound of the Cold War tipping quietly in America's favor. For nearly 2 decades, the Soviet Navy operated under a single guiding belief. Oceans could be mastered by noise. In their war rooms and naval academies, Soviet planners built a doctrine where brute force and sensor saturation formed the unshakable backbone of maritime defense. Submarines were not expected to be silent, they were expected to be tough. Big reactors, powerful propulsion, dense hulls, massive torpedo loadouts. A doctrine forged by industrial logic, not acoustic nuance. Their reasoning seemed sound. In open ocean, they believed, even the most advanced submarine could not escape the overlapping net of hydrophones, sonar pickets, and naval patrol zones. Soviet sonar systems like the MGK-400 series were among the largest and most powerful of their era. And while Soviet subs were undeniably louder than their Western counterparts, they carried more weapons, had deeper test depths, and could endure in combat. They believed war at sea would be a brawl, not a whisper. To reinforce this model, the Soviets invested heavily in fixed sonar lines and naval choke points. The GUK Gap, the Sea of Okhotsk, and the Barents became sound fences, places where any NATO sub would have to pass through layers of sensors. Dozens of destroyers, frigates, and sub-hunters patrolled these corridors. Airborne surveillance added even more pressure from above. The theory, if it moves, we'll hear it. But theory was not reality. The flaw in the Soviet model wasn't technological, it was philosophical. They underestimated the American obsession with silence. While the USSR refined loud, rugged systems, the U.S. Navy pursued acoustic invisibility as an existential priority. Naval analysts in Moscow understood quieting as a side effect of design. In America, it was the design, and they missed it. Reports from KGB informants inside Western shipyards were often disregarded. One claimed the Americans were isolating internal machinery on rubber mounts. Another reported pump jet propulsion replacing traditional propellers. Both were labeled as exaggerations. "They are building Ferraris for the ocean," one Soviet engineer scoffed. And we are building tractors with armor. This blind spot extended to training as well. Soviet sonar officers were expected to identify known threats by audio signature, but they were not trained to expect absence. The idea that an American submarine might pass within a few kilometers and leave no trace seemed like fantasy, but fantasy had become doctrine. In one Soviet naval manual, a chilling line now stands out. Any object of threat must first be detected before it can be feared. The B-52 could be tracked. The Polaris missile could be watched. But the quiet American submarine? It simply disappeared. And that's what made it terrifying. By the late 1960 seconds, Soviet naval power appeared immense on paper. Over 400 submarines, many of them nuclear, formed the backbone of a strategy designed to overwhelm the seas through presence alone. From Murmansk to Vladivostok, Soviet admirals preached a gospel of saturation. More sonar, more patrols, more steel in the water. If a Western submarine entered Soviet-influenced waters, it would be tracked, boxed in, and eliminated. But there was a flaw at the center of this mighty web. It assumed that detection was inevitable. The doctrine guiding the Soviet Navy, especially its submarine fleet, was structured around three concentric strategies: perimeter detection, pursuit engagement, and close-quarters neutralization. The first ring relied on passive sonar arrays along key geographic choke points: the GIUK Gap, the Kuril Straits, the Greenland-Iceland-Faroes axis. The second ring used hunter-killer submarines to shadow incoming contacts. The third, most lethal ring, deployed air and sea assets to launch a kill strike. It looked airtight, but it was all built on the assumption that the target submarine would eventually make a noise. So when U.S. submarines stopped making noise, the rings collapsed. American engineers, especially within the Naval Sea Systems Command, NAVSEA, had poured vast sums into acoustic innovation. New hull designs like the teardrop-shaped skipjack and thresher classes prioritized hydrodynamics. Turbines were redesigned for quieter operation. Even the placement of screws and sonar domes was re-engineered to reduce wake turbulence. And then came the breakthrough: raft-mounted machinery. By isolating pumps, turbines, and generators inside vibration-damping mounts, American submarines silenced the internal thrum that had once made every nuclear vessel an acoustic beacon. Combined with pump-jet propulsion replacing traditional screw blades, the result was not a quieter submarine. It was a submarine that vanished. Soviet doctrine couldn't adapt fast enough. Training manuals still emphasized screw blade harmonic detection and cavitation spikes. Sonar operators were rewarded for catching classic signatures. A submarine that emitted no such signals became an unsolvable puzzle, one the entire Soviet structure refused to admit existed. Desperate, Soviet strategists doubled down. They built more ASW aircraft, commissioned faster attack submarines, filled the ocean with more sensors, but they were throwing nets at shadows, and shadows can't be caught. The silence of America's next-generation submarines was not an anomaly. It was the new battlefield. The flashpoint came in 1972, in the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. A Soviet Echo-2 class guided missile submarine was tasked with patrolling a known strategic corridor, part of an exercise simulating interception of U.S. carrier battle groups. Soviet command was confident. The Okhotsk region was ringed with sonar buoys, monitored by Il-38 anti-submarine patrol aircraft, and reinforced by two surface escort groups. No American vessel could breach it undetected, except one already had. As the Echo-2 completed its second patrol arc, sonar officers aboard picked up faint disturbances, low-frequency shifts that didn't match any Soviet signature. One dismissed it as interference from a migrating whale pod. Another suggested ice drifts. But in truth, they were hearing something real, something nearby. It was the USS Grayback, a modified American fast-attack submarine fitted with new quieting technology and specialized sensors. It had slipped into the Okhotsk perimeter 5 days earlier and had been trailing the Echo-2 from a distance of just 3,000 yards, closer than any American boat had ever dared, and no one had seen it. Grayback recorded everything: patrol patterns, reactor signatures, propeller harmonics. Even the Echo 2's sonar pings were stored for later analysis. The U.S. submarine remained submerged and silent, never once triggering a single Soviet alarm. It tracked its target from behind, slid beneath it at one point, and then, without ceremony, turned and left. The Soviets never knew. Only later, when a declassified briefing made its way into naval intelligence circles via indirect disclosures to NATO allies, did the scale of the intrusion become apparent. The Americans hadn't just entered Soviet-controlled waters. They'd mapped the entire acoustic profile of a strategic missile submarine and exited without leaving a trace. One Soviet sonar technician, shown the classified acoustic logs years later, reportedly muttered, "This couldn't be from Okhotsk. We would have heard them. We always hear them, but they hadn't. Not this time." The Greyback event shattered illusions. For Soviet naval intelligence, it was the first undeniable proof that the Americans had crossed into the realm of acoustic invisibility. It wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't disinformation. It was real. And far worse, it had already happened. When the classified report of the Greyback incident reached Naval Command in Moscow, it didn't cause panic. It caused rejection. The Admiralty's first reaction wasn't alarm, it was disbelief. Senior officers in the Northern and Pacific fleets dismissed the briefing as NATO psychological warfare. A submarine sneaking into Okhotsk undetected, trailing a Soviet missile boat for hours, escaping unseen? It sounded too perfect to American. Admiral Chernovin, then Deputy Chief of the Navy, allegedly tossed the dossier onto his desk and said, "Either this is fiction, or we've built glass submarines." His staff laughed. But the laughter wouldn't last. Within weeks, two more unusual sonar anomalies were reported near the Kola Peninsula. Once again, no visual contact, no tracking, only faint shifts on passive sonar, low frequency, unnatural, fleeting. Operators began whispering about a phantom boat running circles around their patrol zones. Some even wondered if the Americans had developed an entirely new propulsion system. Still, Command refused to issue an alert. Instead, they blamed operator fatigue, training gaps, even weather-related sonar distortion. One internal memo from the Ministry of Defense theorized that recent NATO exercises had seeded false acoustic triggers in Soviet command networks to breed confusion. In other words, it was all electronic deception. Then came the kicker. Through diplomatic backchannels, the Americans released footage, grayscale, time-stamped, marked for eyes only, showing the Greyback's periscope images of a Soviet Echo 2 class boat from just 3,000 meters. The vessel was unaware, exposed, vulnerable. The KGB verified the footage. There could be no more denial. Yet even with irrefutable evidence, Soviet Naval Command refused to shift doctrine. They claimed the intrusion had only succeeded due to abnormal oceanic conditions. Reports were buried. Officers who had raised alarms were reassigned. One sonar officer who described the American approach as a ghost in the deep was transferred to a remote Arctic outpost. The political logic was simple. Accepting the truth meant admitting strategic failure. And in the Soviet military bureaucracy, failure, especially from above, was unthinkable. So instead, they doubled down. New sonar drills, expanded patrol zones, denser minefields. But none of it addressed the core problem. They were no longer fighting submarines. They were fighting shadows. And every time a sonar screen stayed blank, a quiet terror grew among the fleet what else had already passed them by. By early 1973, Soviet naval intelligence reached a consensus not on the existence of undetectable American submarines, but on their method of concealment. The new party line was clear. The U.S. wasn't actually silent. It was jamming Soviet sonar. This theory, while flawed, gave the Kremlin something it could work with. Electronic warfare was understandable. It could be countered with countermeasures, patches, and newer frequencies. It made the problem fixable, and above all, It protected Soviet pride. The working assumption was this: American submarines were emitting low-level acoustic pulses, masked as ambient ocean noise, to blind Soviet sonar arrays. These pulses, they believed, confused processors, mimicked biological noise, or simply overloaded key frequency bands. Electronic deception had already been used in air warfare, why not at sea? So the Soviets pivoted. They poured millions of rubles into the rapid development of anti-jamming sonar modes. The MGK-503 system was rushed into testing, designed to operate across multiple frequency bands and adapt in real time to shifting acoustic interference. Submarine crews were ordered to retrain with new signal patterns and noise discrimination algorithms. But results were disappointing. During a Black Sea exercise in mid-1974, Project 670, one Victor-class attack submarines simulated pursuit of an enemy acoustic signature seeded into the drill by Naval Command. The operators were told to expect jamming, filter noise, and track the target. Both failed. One sub identified a passing container ship. The other pinged a decoy and declared mission success on a dead object. The theory was breaking down. Even worse, as more U.S. submarines were detected after they had exited Soviet-controlled waters only by their distant prop wash or delayed wake, it became clear there was no active interference, no pulses, no jamming signals. The Americans weren't hiding behind deception. They simply weren't making noise. Still, Moscow clung to the myth. A Ministry of Defense internal memo in late 1975 declared, "The enemy's silence is a mask, not a reality. Where there is motion, there is signature. We must look deeper." So they did deeper into the wrong direction. And with each passing year, American submarines grew quieter, while Soviet scientists hunted ghosts in data that no longer existed. In a war of signal versus silence, the Soviets were listening for tricks. But what they needed to fear was nothing at all. By 1976, after the jamming theory collapsed under field testing and faulty engagements, Soviet Naval Command shifted its hypothesis again, this time to terrain-based stealth. If American submarines weren't jamming Soviet sonar, perhaps they were simply exploiting the environment to slip through undetected. The new theory, U.S. boats were hugging the seabed, hiding in the topography of the ocean floor, and using terrain masking to avoid sonar detection. The belief took root quickly. Soviet hydroacoustic analysts revised hundreds of submarine tracks with this new lens. Sonar anomalies, previously dismissed as noise, were reinterpreted as possible bottom gliders, submarines, creeping along trenches and underwater ridges to mask their approach. It gave Soviet officers a tactical explanation they could work with. The Americans aren't ghosts. They're just playing the angles better. What even quat? This idea birthed a flurry of reaction. Specialized sonar buoys were deployed to map seafloor echoes more aggressively. Northern Fleet submarines began training with downward-focused sonar sweeps. A new class of deep detection towed arrays was developed, including the MG-534 series, calibrated to isolate returns bouncing off benthic terrain. They also introduced bottom-sweep torpedoes designed to detonate close to the ocean floor and flush out supposed intruders. But the theory failed again. During a 1978 naval exercise near the Kuril Islands, Soviet destroyers, equipped with the latest benthic sonar arrays, attempted to track an invisible contact, picked up by a reconnaissance aircraft. They scoured the seafloor, dropped pattern charges, deployed decoys, and found nothing. The contact vanished. 3 weeks later, American satellite surveillance leaked images of the exercise, along with precise details of Soviet formation patterns and escort paths. The implication was clear. A U.S. submarine had watched the entire operation from above the detection zone, not beneath it. It hadn't been hiding in the bottom terrain. It had simply passed overhead. The real shock came when analysts at the Soviet Naval Research Institute reviewed ambient ocean recordings taken during the incident. Faint engine harmonics were present, but not where the bottom-hugging theory predicted. Instead, they were mid-water range and extraordinarily faint. When extrapolated, they pointed to a signature well above the seafloor, moving faster than expected. The implications were devastating. Not only were the American submarines not hugging the bottom they didn't need to, they were quiet enough to operate in open water, completely undetected. The seafloor wasn't their camouflage. Their silence was. Still, Soviet command refused to fully pivot. They clung to the idea that bottom hugging was at least part of the solution. Manuals were updated. Exercises continued. And all the while, the Americans sailed circles around them in the open, invisible, unchallenged. Behind the reinforced concrete walls of the KGB's Naval Directorate, a troubling pattern was emerging. Every intercepted cable, every debriefed defector, and every underwater anomaly pointed to a single devastating truth. They didn't know how the Americans were doing it. The Soviet intelligence machine had long prided itself on penetrating Western secrets. Industrial espionage, technical leaks, and recruitment of low-level defense contractors had given the USSR glimpses into America's military-industrial heart. But submarine quieting real. Operational stealth at sea remained maddeningly elusive. The CIA and the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence had prepared for this. A calculated campaign of disinformation fed false narratives into Soviet networks. Blueprints were subtly altered before being leaked. Shipyard whistleblowers gave technically plausible but deliberately incomplete details of American noise-dampening systems. Some KGB analysts believed U.S. submarines had adopted hull-deforming technologies. Others were convinced of experimental biomimicry, using manta ray-like propulsion systems. None of it was real. The true innovations were far less exotic and far more dangerous. Beginning in the late 1960s, American acoustic labs, especially the Navy's research facility in Annapolis, pioneered dozens of breakthroughs that never made headlines. These included precision machine turbine rotors, anechoic coatings that absorbed sonar pings, and pump jet propulsors that eliminated blade cavitation. Every improvement shaved decibels off the noise floor. Every innovation widened the detection gap. Crucially, these systems weren't just built, they were integrated. American submarine design became a choreography of quieting. Every valve isolated, every pipe buffered, every rotating part dampened. There was no single secret, only relentless refinement. But the Soviets couldn't see it. Their espionage framework was built for singularity, for the one file. The blueprint. The defector with the golden key. They didn't understand that America's advantage wasn't a classified schematic. It was doctrine. It was process. A former CIA analyst later reflected, "We didn't hide a superweapon. We hid a philosophy." Meanwhile, in Moscow, naval intelligence doubled down on misdirection. When analysts tried to present the growing picture of multiple overlapping acoustic advancements, they were met with skepticism. One internal report described it as technological paranoia. Another warned against attributing mythical qualities to capitalist vessels. The consequences were fatal. In 1980, a Soviet Victor III-class submarine collided with the U.S. submarine USS Drum, not because the Americans had blundered, but because the Soviets never heard them coming. The Americans evaded with minimal damage. The Soviets returned home with a shattered bow and more questions than answers. That incident was sealed in classified archives. But within the upper ranks of Soviet naval command, a chilling realization took hold. They weren't being jammed. They weren't being outmaneuvered. They were being ignored, passed by without detection, without defense, and without recourse. The age of acoustic supremacy was no longer theoretical. It was already operational. By 1981, the Soviet Navy finally began to grasp the scale of what they were facing, not a single submarine class, but an entire system of American undersea dominance. It wasn't just about a quiet boat, it was about an ecosystem designed to disappear at every level. At the center of this transformation was the Los Angeles-class attack submarine, launched in 1976. On paper, it was faster, deeper diving, and more advanced than any American sub before it. But those specs masked its true advantage: the aggressive pursuit of acoustic invisibility. Unlike Soviet boats, which prioritized speed, depth, and weapon loadouts, the 688 class was optimized for silence first. From the moment steel was cut at Newport News or Groton, every weld, mount, and pipe layout was designed to suppress sound. Major rotating machinery was mounted on vibration-dampening rafts. Auxiliary systems were re-engineered to emit zero-tonal resonance. Even fluid dynamics were weaponized. External hulls were coated with anechoic tiles, rubber-like blocks that absorbed sonar pings instead of reflecting them. Internally, the U.S. Navy had created a feedback loop of acoustic perfection. Submarines were built, tested in controlled environments, then retuned. If a pump was 2 decibels too loud, it was replaced. If a coolant line produced harmonic reverb at cruising speed, it was rerouted. Every decibel shaved meant one more layer of advantage. But it wasn't just the hardware. The U.S. had built a culture of acoustic discipline. Sailors on fast attack subs were trained not just in navigation or weapons, but in silence. Every hatch, every dropped wrench, every vibration mattered. It wasn't superstition, it was survival. One sonar officer put it best: on a Los Angeles-class sub, noise discipline is as sacred as fire control. You don't whisper because someone's sleeping, you whisper because the enemy might be listening 1,000 miles away. And the ecosystem extended beyond the sub. U.S. intelligence fused these stealth platforms with real-time satellite surveillance, undersea hydrophone networks, like SOSUS sound, surveillance system, and advanced signal processing at the Office of Naval Intelligence. This meant U.S. boats not only avoided detection, they could track Soviet vessels across ocean basins, relaying their position without ever surfacing. Meanwhile, Soviet submarines, louder, leakier, and poorly coordinated, plowed through the water, unaware they were being watched, studied, recorded. By the early 82nds, entire Soviet fleet exercises were rendered meaningless. Los Angeles-class boats would tail missile subs for weeks, surfacing only after the mission was complete, with full audio logs and acoustic profiles. The most humiliating moment came in 1983, when the USS Batfish trailed a Soviet Yankee-class sub inside the Sea of Okhotsk Soviet territorial waters for over 5 days. It maneuvered underneath the Soviet boat, recorded its missile tube closures, and quietly exited. The Soviets never detected it. The mission was logged, debriefed, sent up the U.S. chain of command. In Moscow, no alarm was ever raised, because they never knew it happened. The Americans weren't just building better submarines. They had built a weaponized absence, a machine designed not to fight but to vanish, not to challenge Soviet naval power, but to invalidate it. The tipping point came not during a massive confrontation, but in a series of quiet defeats so absolute, they didn't even register on Soviet radar, literally. From 1982 to 1985, American submarines executed a series of clandestine operations that would later be collectively known inside the Pentagon as the Corridor Runs missions, designed to test and prove the limits of Soviet naval detection in their most secure waters. Targets included choke points near Petropavlovsk, heavily patrolled waters off the Kamchatka Peninsula, and the infamous Sea of Okhotsk bastion. The goal wasn't destruction. It was exposure. The USS Haddo and later the USS Buffalo, both Los Angeles-class boats, conducted surveillance runs so deep into Soviet maritime territory that their logs read like fiction. Each tracked Soviet strategic missile submarines, recorded encrypted communications via underwater cable taps, and monitored entire fleet exercises, all while never being detected. And when these logs were shared with U.S. Navy leadership, the message was clear. Soviet naval superiority was a myth. Back in the USSR, it was a different story. In 1984, a Soviet Delta-class boomer failed to make scheduled contact with Fleet Command. Panic set in. The possibility of an American attack, or worse, a defection, triggered a full-scale ASW sweep involving over 12 ships and multiple Il-38 aircraft. They found nothing. What they didn't know. The submarine had suffered minor propulsion failure and had been shadowed by the USS Pintado for the previous 3 days. The American sub had recorded the malfunction, matched the Delta's course deviation, and logged everything before returning to deeper waters, undetected. Again, it wasn't combat that humiliated the Soviet Navy. It was irrelevance. In the words of a U.S. sub-captain, they sailed their oceans. We owned them. By 1985, Soviet crews began referring to certain patrol zones as the dark zones, areas where sonar often returned blank screens, where American contacts were suspected but never confirmed. The phrase was whispered, not documented. Soviet sailors grew uneasy. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they never saw. In one chilling episode, during a simulated alert drill off the Barents coast, a Soviet submarine squadron was tasked with locating a presumed enemy contact. They launched depth charges, ran wide sonar sweeps, even dropped decoys, all while being watched. The USS City of Corpus Christi, positioned 1,000 feet below the thermocline, recorded the entire event. Later, its crew would joke, "We attended their exercise." From the front row, the humiliation was complete. Naval Command in Moscow stopped referring to these incidents in operational terms. Instead, they became euphemisms. Unconfirmed acoustic event, background anomaly, transient noise field. Each phrase meant the same thing. The Americans were there, and the Soviets couldn't touch them. By the late 1980 seconds, the silence had become deafening. The Soviet Navy, once imagined as the great equalizer in the Cold War, was crumbling under the weight of its own illusions. Submarines that couldn't hide, sonar nets that couldn't listen, a doctrine that no longer applied. What the Kremlin finally understood was devastating. This wasn't just a tactical failure, it was strategic entropy. American submarines hadn't simply outmaneuvered their Soviet counterparts. They had rendered entire war plans obsolete. The Red Banner Northern Fleet, which had once projected strength from the Arctic to the Atlantic, now operated on caution and denial. Patrols were limited. Alert statuses were tightened. Missions were often redefined as routine presence rather than deterrent operations. Inside the Soviet General Staff, debates turned bitter. Some proposed an accelerated buildup, new subs, newer sensors, deeper drills. Others, especially within the GRU and the military-industrial complex, warned that no amount of funding could close the gap fast enough. The realists knew the truth. Acoustic superiority wasn't just a technical milestone. It was a philosophical revolution. America had moved from deterrence to invisibility. The final blow came with Operation Ivy Bells. When the Soviets learned, through a high-level defector, that the U.S. had been tapping underwater communication cables on the Soviet seafloor for over a decade, without detection, shock gave way to paralysis. This wasn't just espionage. It was dominion. American submarines had quietly parked themselves on the USSR's strategic nerve lines and listened at will, and no one had heard them. Naval Command was left with no countermeasure, no doctrine, no viable response. The Soviet fleet could no longer guarantee the security of its own waters, let alone contest NATO in the Atlantic or Pacific. Soviet Admiral Chernovin, now the Navy's commander-in-chief, is rumored to have stared silently at the Ivy Bells briefing before muttering, "We're chasing ghosts in our own sea." It wasn't metaphor. It was policy failure. From a position of supposed naval parity, the Soviet Union had descended into reactive scrambling. Entire segments of its maritime strategy, bastion defense, ballistic submarine patrol coverage, forward ASW pickets collapsed not because of direct conflict, but because of irrelevance. In a war defined by presence, the Americans had weaponized absence, and that was something no Soviet doctrine could outmatch. Today, the Los Angeles-class submarine still sails older now, modernized, and soon to be replaced. But its legacy casts a long, silent shadow across naval history. In the cold archives of Severomorsk, there are still records redacted, partially burned, or mislabeled that hint at what really happened. A sonar anomaly here, a missing contact report there, and a phrase that appears again and again in Soviet documents from the late Cold War: no acoustic return. These three words, clinical, unemotional, buried the truth of a vanished doctrine. For decades, the Soviet Navy had operated on the assumption that the oceans were transparent, that noise was inevitable, and that detection was a matter of time and pressure. The Americans disproved all of it, not with force, but with silence. And that silence echoes into the present. Modern Russian submarines, like the Yasen class, have narrowed the acoustic gap, but only because they follow the same playbook pioneered by their Cold War adversaries. They borrow from the Los Angeles class, not just in engineering, but in philosophy. That dominance begins where detection ends. For the U.S. Navy, the lesson was immortalized in steel and salt water. Victory doesn't always come from firepower or fleet size. Sometimes it comes from being unheard, unseen, and unacknowledged, from passing under the enemy's fleet not to strike, but to remind them they were never safe. In an era where aircraft carriers projected power and ballistic missiles promised mutual destruction, it was a silent hunter beneath the sea that redrew the balance. No press release, no headline, just a quiet patrol, just an empty sonar screen, and the ghost of a submarine slipping past the last bastion of Soviet pride, undetected.